Hello, welcome back to the channel and welcome to a wet, windy and thoroughly desaturated January here in the UK. We're back at DK Engineering, for those of you guys who followed the channel towards the end of last year. This is where we filmed my F12 TDF back to back with the original 250 TDF. Today they have something extremely special in stock. There's nothing quite like a naturally aspirated Porsche V8 to warm the heart. So without further ado, let's show you around this very special car, then go for a drive. For those of you guys that are familiar with this car, you're probably thinking it's not naturally aspirated. Well, I know it's a hybrid car, but technically the engine itself is not assisted with any aspiration through supercharging, turbocharging, or any such forth. This is purely assisted by a very fancy hybrid drivetrain. So welcome to the Porsche 918 Spyder. Now, for those of you guys that have been on this journey of the Mr. JWW channel for a while, you may be familiar with the time that I had a drag race against this car, well, not this exact car, but against a Porsche 918 when I owned a McLaren 675 LT. Nose to nose, these two were against each other up until about 100 miles an hour when the 918 just decided to take on an entirely different life form and vanish into the horizon. And ever since that day, I have been thoroughly blown away and impressed and fascinated, actually, by not only this car, but the hypercar category and just how ballistically fast they are. That was an amazing demonstration for me of the true performance and power of these cars. But let me just run you through the spec of this car because it is quite unique, and then most importantly, let's go for a drive. So first of all, the overall colour is meteor grey, which is not necessarily overly appropriate in this weather, but still it looks absolutely incredible. But what it really allows for is how much the acid green calipers pop off the car. Now, while we're down here on the wheels, you might have noticed that these do not have the more conventional diamond cut 918 wheels, but I absolutely love these. These are called platinum silk finished wheels. And as you can see, if I get up close, there's no diamond finish, but it does tie in with the overall body color of the vehicle. Now, you might be forgiven for thinking that this was applied aftermarket, that they might have been sprayed, but this was actually a little known Porsche factory option. So this is actually a really rare spec. And you might have also noticed that this is a non-Weissach pack version. Now, the Weissach pack was famously the kit which assisted in the 918 breaking the production car world record around the Nürburgring, but this car, I love it without it. It's so clean. Now, arguably, if we put a Weissach pack car next to this, it might not quite have the same crazy flair, but I love the timeless feel of this car. It's not too fussy, it's a really classy spec, and I really enjoy things like the iridescent acid green highlighting around key components of the car. Just a nod to this special word here, hybrid, and we shall talk about that once we get inside. Speaking of inside, I'm going to introduce you to quite a special 918 interior as well. Check this out. Now, the red on the inside of this car is called garnet red. It's a beautiful interior. But interestingly, again, what makes this car unique is the contrast piping and stitching isn't the acid green which is more commonly found on the car. I think it gives this car such a unique character. It's really nice to get in these cars, which they are so iconic for their famous specs, but when you see one which is spec'd differently, just gives the whole car a fresh take. I love that. And just look, all of this carbon tub is exposed and things like this. Now, if you're familiar with the interior of a Carrera GT, this diamond stitched padding here flows throughout that car. Also famously found within the boot liner as well, where you store the roof. And I just like that. Little nods to history, just on simple things like quilted stitching, which is very cool. Anyway, this channel's all about driving. So let's go and do that. And here we are, behold the cockpit of the 918 Spyder. It's an amazing, amazing place to be. Now, interestingly, we take the layout of this steering wheel almost for granted now because we've seen the styling cues of this filter its way down into the more mass-produced Porsches. But when this launched, this is the car that set the template for how Porsche steering wheels look of the current generation, even down to this drive select switch here, which we'll get onto later because that's where all of the fun happens. But still drawing comparisons with the Carrera GT. Down here, look, on the central console, this is where they've engraved the chassis number. Now, this is chassis 505, so car number 505, but what I really like is that not only have they physically engraved it, but also they've digitally applied it on the dashboard right there. See that in the centre? There's car number 505. Really like that. It's like a sort of contemporary take on chassis number engraving, so that's pretty cool. And then, of course, the significant car about this is you can drive it entirely in electric. And now we are in E-Power mode. Drive. You might just be able to hear that engage in E mode. Let's take the parking brake off. And we are ready to drive in E mode. I'm just going to give this a quick wipe so we can actually see where we're going. And we're in the beautiful DK Engineering courtyard here. Let's set off. That's weird. E mode. So, I think the E mode's fascinating. So I know the figures that surround this car to do with Nürburgring lap records and the 0 to 60 times, how ballistically quick it is. We all get tied up in that, don't we, when we're talking about hypercars, which I totally understand. But often E mode gets overlooked. Now you can drive, I think it's up to 90 miles an hour in electric mode alone. This is an example of the future tech which is going to filter down into our more mass-produced cars. Now I'm driving this at quite an appropriate time really, because Porsche have just launched their 992 Generation 911 and they've left space in the gearbox for an electric motor, which means we're definitely going to be seeing a hybrid variant of the new 911 at some point, and that's what this car is all about. This was their proof of concept. This was their, don't worry, we can make hybrids cool. And as a result, here we are, driving along in, for all intents and purposes, right now, an electric-powered hypercar. It's a pretty weird experience, and because this car is otherwise designed to be raw and pure, you can hear every facet of this thing moving around in terms of suspension, tyres, chassis, components moving, which you otherwise wouldn't hear when the engine is on. Speaking of engine, how cool is that? We just seamlessly burst into life with that engine. That's incredible. So, with the flick of the paddle shift, it knew that I wanted to interact with the engine, and there we are, it just burst into life. Put it into E mode. I can't stress to you how sophisticated that engineering is, to be able to seamlessly switch between the electric drivetrain and then just casually throw in a 600 horsepower V8 engine seamlessly. It is unbelievable. There's not a single jerk. You're just driving along and you just put it into gear like that. There it is. What an amazing thing. So, the concept was launched in 2010. The finished car was then subsequently launched in 2012. The production started in 2013 and then ended in 2015. Through that production period from 13 to 15, they made 918 cars, appropriately, and the value skyrocketed because they had over 2,000 letters of intent for this car. So right now, the car I'm driving is just over £1 million. Don't get me wrong, massive amount of coin, but in terms of value for current market of a 918, this is probably the best I've seen, actually. Now, they're all left-hand drive. You can't buy a right-hand drive one even if you do live in a right-hand drive market, and so they all seem to sit at a value well over £1 million. So what's it like to drive? Well, first of all, let's get the prices out of the way. You are aware that you're in a £1 million hypercar, which is an event in itself, but Porsche being Porsche, you quickly lull into this feeling that you can actually use this every single day. Now, we're in these, what became known as the 918 carbon bucket seats, which eventually made their way into the GT3 RS, and you could definitely drive that car every single day. And the overall platform of it, I mean, it's got plenty of headroom. Don't forget as well, of the 3 hypercars that launched around that time, the McLaren P1, the LaFerrari, and this was the only car that was 4-wheel drive. You could take the roof off and you could run it for any length of time, decent distance, on pure electric mode alone. So those 3 things in itself add up to this, in my eyes, being probably the most compelling package. It's also a naturally aspirated version of a V8 engine, meaning that, yes, while it is hybrid assist, the actual engine itself has no forced induction, so it has maintained that wonderful sound. And when you're in it, it is kind of weird approaching a car with a Porsche badge on it and hearing a sound like this. That's a V8 engine. That's a Porsche racing developed V8 engine. It was an engine that was developed for LMP2 racing car. Again, a tip of the hat in a way to the Carrera GT, which used an LMP1 derived naturally aspirated V10. But this thing connected to the hybrid unit is unbelievable. Now, what's interesting, when you set off in just hybrid mode, you become familiar with the torque characteristic of when you press the accelerator, what that pull feels like. And what's interesting, that even when the electric engine joins forces with the petrol engine, you're still aware of the character traits of the torque that electric engine provides. So when you're using it in conjunction with the V8, you're aware of just how much assist that electric motor is providing. It's an incredible feeling. So back on the figure of torque, it's actually ridiculous. 944 pounds-feet. Pounds-feet. Not Newton meters, pounds-feet of torque. And of that feeling, doesn't matter what gear you're in, there is a relentless surge of energy available under your right foot all the time. And when you are in a sort of lower appropriate gear, this thing really is in a space of its own. Once you start to exploit it and just begin to just scratch the surface of its potential, you do understand why these are hypercar brackets. Like, I mean, today, look, this car is for sale. It's not my car. It's somewhat of a damp January. The tarmac is cold. We're not going to be taking any liberties in this. But what I do love is that just under the surface of what I'm experiencing, you get this feeling that there is a proper thoroughbred supercar under there. I should be saying hypercar, really, under there, just ready to readjust your smile glands. It's amazing. And having this V8, it's so strange. I've actually never heard an engine quite like it. And you really can pick up on the undertones of the race car elements of that engine. I mean, just listen. When was the last time you heard a V8 like this? It's got its own tone, hasn't it? It's entirely got its own tone. And of course, it's also connected to Porsche's incredibly smooth 7-speed PDK gearbox. And once again, because the majority of the torque is going through the hybrid unit, that twin clutch gearbox isn't